This is Monster Train. So after Slay the Spire came out and sort of popularized the whole idea of adding a deck building aspect to a roguelite, sort of randomly generated run sort of idea, a couple of other people, well I guess a lot of other developers really, started to get other ideas and try their hand at that sort of emerging subgenre as well, and it became a pretty popular thing to try. However, there are a few that really stand out as games that have done it differently, games that have added a whole bunch of other bits of personality and strange mechanics and the like to it to make something very different. And one of those is One Step from Eden, which I plan on covering very soon because it's amazing. The other one that stands out to me is this. Monster Train is a roguelite deck builder, but with a twist of really, it feels a lot like a tabletop game. It feels like the kind of thing that you would actually see as like a game mode in Ascension, or like you could go to Barnes & Noble and buy it physically. It feels like a deck builder, a physical deck builder with the sort of like strategy board layer to it, which is pretty neat. So the whole concept is that you are kind of the bad guys in a way, and you're trying to free hell from angels that have taken it over, and well, hell has in fact actually frozen over, and your whole goal is to take this train throughout the various layers of hell and unfreeze it and kick the angels out. You do this by selecting two different factions, sort of tribes of the various denizens of hell, and can go throughout the whole area on a train. And this train is where the main aspects of gameplay all actually take place. So you'll see here you have a sort of strategic board idea where you go through each circle of hell, and each one has two different paths. You choose one path over the other. They have 2 to 3 different things that you can select on the side, everything from like shops to upgrade your spells or your creatures, or something to restore the health of your core, which is what you actually need to defend in order to win. If that gets exploded, then you lose immediately, to new artifacts and new creature draws and stuff like that. So this is sort of your in-between path selection that a lot of games do, only it has like a 2-path per circle idea, which is kind of neat. And sometimes there's also a third selection that you can make that you always get no matter which of the 2 paths in each circle you choose, and that'll usually be some sort of large overarching upgrade. It could be something for your champion, because every faction has a champion creature, a free, like a 0 mana cost creature that you can play that's always in your hand at the beginning of every match, so it's sort of like your main creature that you rely on to start things off with. And you also have those sort of choose-your-own-adventure random encounters that are a bit like the way that Slay the Spire does it. You have a bit of like a storybook selection of multiple choices that allow you to do different things, and each choice has different consequences. Sometimes they may be a bit negative but have a positive aspect. Sometimes they may just be entirely positive, and usually there's a lot of like risk-reward in those, just as in games like Slay the Spire, where oftentimes the more you're willing to pay or the more you're willing to risk, the better the potential rewards are if you succeed. And actually, risk-reward comes into a lot of the mechanics of this game, which I very much like. I think that risk-reward mechanics in general in games are things that I always enjoy, because it allows you to sort of choose your own, like the skill level that you feel comfortable with, and then get rewarded accordingly, and sometimes maybe press it a little bit to see if you can do better than you think you might and get rewarded even better for it. I enjoy mechanics like that. And then of course at the sort of gateway to each new circle there is a battle, and the cool thing about the battles is that they tell you in general what kind of units you're going to be facing off against, so you can prepare a little bit. And they also have another one of these risk-reward mechanics, in that you can choose to make the battle more difficult in some way, but it gives you an extra reward. It's something that you can toggle before every battle starts, so that you can do it sometimes, but not all the time if you want to. And these vary from, making sure that every enemy creature has extra armor when they're added, but you get like a whole bunch of extra gold at the end, or making it to where certain creatures die and explode and damage you, but you get like an extra artifact at the end, stuff like that. You can just make the fight more difficult if you feel confident enough, and get the listed reward for it, which is a fun idea. The battles themselves take place on the train, which has multiple levels. It's got 4 levels, but the 4th level is where your core is, the thing that everyone is trying to get to and destroy, and you don't really get to affect that level too much. The actual main sort of board of the game, you could say, are the first 3 levels of the train, and each one has a capacity of these 5 dots that can be changed, expanded in different ways, but that's how it starts. And every creature card that you draw also has a listed capacity that it takes up, so that determines how many creatures you can have on each floor, depending on how big each one is. And there are several locations you can put the creatures in whatever order you want to, because creatures tend to get attacked from the front first, so you may have like really strong glass cannons in the back protected by very strong creatures in the front, for instance. That's a common strategy to help make sure that your very powerful creatures don't die as quickly. And the combat takes place in a sort of like a turn-based fashion, where after you choose to end your turn, your enemies that are on that level will attack, and then your creatures on that level will attack, and then whoever's left, your creatures will stay there, and then if there are any enemies left on that floor, they will move up to the next floor, and you'll have to defend it there, and that of course is how they get to the top eventually and damage your core that you want to stop from happening. So you could almost consider it a bit like a tower defense, but like a very deconstructed tower defense in terms of its mechanics. You're just trying to keep them from reaching the nexus, prevent them from reaching your core, and you gotta just try and destroy all waves of creatures before they get there. Now your core is not defenseless. It actually has a fairly powerful attack that hits everyone on the floor, but enemies do get to attack first, so they will inevitably do some damage to it when they reach it before the core just absolutely destroys them and just totally disintegrates them with this huge red wave. Although, of course, once you get to the much tougher enemies in the boss fights and the like, you will find that they are quite capable of single-handedly destroying your core if you don't do enough damage to them before they get there. So ideally, you're trying to just throw everything you can at these enemies to prevent them from moving up too far. And there are, of course, other mechanics involved in this, like, for instance, daze, which makes it to where enemies cannot move between floors while they're dazed, and some other things like that. There are even some oftentimes very rare and very expensive cards that can move enemies up or down, or sometimes even friendlies move them up or down, because you may not have a creature that you want to play that will fit on the next floor up, but you have a really strong creature down below that you want to move up. So the idea of moving between floors, very much in the sense of like a tactics RPG, movement tends to be a very expensive, very valuable thing, since placement and overall positioning is so tactically important, and that's the case in this game as well. So movement between floors is a very expensive skill to have. It's something that's really useful to have as well. Each faction has its own set of creatures, spells, and artifacts and the like, and you choose two factions because you will have the main faction, the one that you choose first, which is the faction that you get the champion from and where most of your card draws will come from as rewards. But the secondary faction that you choose just allows you to sort of like playing a two-color deck in Magic the Gathering. Yet one of them may be what a lot of your stuff is based off of, but the secondary one helps to accentuate that in some way. It helps to provide some extra utility, some extra strategy by giving you other options that your main faction doesn't have as much of on its own. And there are 5 factions available in the game. You'll start with 2, and you have to do various things to unlock the others. My favorite one so far is the Stygian faction, which is probably the first one that you'll unlock because it's the easiest to unlock in terms of just general gameplay, really. And that's because they are sort of based around a lot of spells, as well as creatures with things like spell weakness to make your spells more powerful against them, or creatures with incant abilities, which are abilities that trigger when you cast spells on the floor they're on. So it's a very like spell-based faction, which I find to be really fun and reminds me of playing like mono black and black green and Magic the Gathering, which is kind of my thing, so that's probably why I like it so much. But every faction does have its own set of mechanics and keywords and creature types and spells and artifacts and ideas, to the point where, very much in like Slay the Spire and pretty much any deck builder really, every character or faction, whatever the game uses, tends to have its own sort of set of dynamics. And for instance, if you play Slay the Spire and you want like to make a poison deck, there's a character for that. Or if you want to play like a rage deck where you try and up your strength as much as possible between every fight and do like huge burst damage, there's a character for that. So the factions in Monster Train work in a similar way, to where each faction has several different mechanics that you could sort of potentially choose from, and that's nice. I like it that they have multiple per faction, so that means that each faction, you don't have to play it the exact same every single time you choose it, and if you choose one of them as a secondary faction, that means there's a bit more variety in terms of what you could reach for from that faction to accentuate the build that you're going for. So for instance, because I like to make a lot of spell-based builds in this, I tend to go with the Stygian faction and then the green guys, because the green guys work a lot like green from Magic the Gathering. They have a lot of very powerful high health creatures, and they invest a lot in buffing creatures, and of course these buffs count as spells, which help for the incant and other spell-based abilities of the Stygian. So these work together to make a run where you are based around doing like huge burst damage with spells and then buffing up your other creatures as much as possible between combats with other spells and enchantments and the like. So it's fun, and the fact that the factions are flexible enough to be used in whatever combination you want to, once you unlock all of them, you'll be able to combine them however you want. That means that there's actually quite a lot of variety here in terms of what you can do for a build on each run, which is sort of one of the big things that a deck builder lives or dies on, is its variety in builds, the amount of stuff that you could potentially do each time you pick it up, especially in a roguelite where repetition of these randomly generated runs is necessary. you want to have each run feel different, so you want to have as much variety, as many different builds as it is possible for you to have. And this definitely does do that very well. It's definitely extremely fully featured feeling with all of the different keywords and creature types and spells and artifacts and things that make each run very colorful, for sure. And I think that's where a lot of the good feelings of the community for like the overwhelmingly positive reviews that this has on Steam comes from. It's just how well polished, how well themed, how much content, how much variety in that content there is. It feels so fully featured and like it's gone through a lot of iterations of testing before the public actually got their hands on it to make it as varied and balanced as possible. When it comes to choosing whatever build you want to try, there's a way you can do it, and that's always super cool. The extra stuff in run that you can do also helps to add to this, like enchanting your spells with new properties, like drastically increasing their power but making them be expended after one use until the next combat, or making them cost less so you can have a selection of like free healing spells or whatever that you want to choose if that seems to fit your style. You can also enchant your creatures with various things, like giving them multi-strike or making them attack first before your enemies, or giving them just a crapload of extra health and making them like a super tanky character. And of course your actual champion will get several upgrades throughout the campaign as well, so that by the end of it you'll have had like four different choices. There was always 2 to choose from each time as to what you want your champion to be like. So the way that your champion starts isn't the way that it's going to end. It's going to have all sorts of extra capabilities and different ways to build by then, which is super cool because that's sort of the signature character, the signature creature that you're calling upon for every battle. So having it be so different and having multiple ways to build it per campaign is awesome. I've also noticed that the artifacts in this game are very powerful. They tend to be very strong effects, unlike something like Slay the Spire, where you can often have many artifacts by the end of it. In this, you won't be getting that many. I mean, you can choose them as often as possible, but even if you do that, by the end you still won't have like dozens of them. You'll just have a handful, but they're all very strong. They tend to be quite expensive too when you're able to buy them, so you have to be careful about which ones you choose, but considering the overarchingly powerful effects that they have, they tend to be very build defining. They're the kinds of things that you choose, that you select when you have the basic idea of what you want to build around for that particular campaign, and they allow you to really accentuate what you're going for because of their just strength. They're very powerful effects. The boss fights are also pretty interesting because the bosses don't obey the same rules that the normal enemies do. They sort of hover outside of the train and then choose a different floor each time. And this makes fighting them kind of interesting because your general strategies for dealing with waves of enemies don't work exactly, since you have to worry about this thing that can go wherever it wants instead of in the normal first to second to third floor order. So they tend to be longer, more protracted fights because of this, and they often have a lot of other mechanics attached to them, things that they can use to aid their sort of minions. You know, they can enchant their other monsters with various things, or even summon new units like big bombs that explode and stuff like that. So the boss fights are a pretty cool highlight of the run because they change. They're mechanically different from the normal combat scenarios, so it's neat that they made them different enough to be unique. They aren't just like very strong normal enemies. They have their own set of mechanics that you have to learn for each one, especially the final boss for each run, which tends to be very powerful and have all sorts of things that it's going to throw at you. So by then you have to be pretty confident in your build and have to have built correctly to stand a chance. And of course the rarer and like legendary cards get some really cool effects later on, and they can be added to with the enchantments and stuff to have all sorts of silly things, like a ridiculously powerful spell that costs like half as much as it should and echoes itself like 3 times by the time that you get to the end. You can build some very silly stuff like that, and that's all added to by some of the other updates the game has received thus far already, like the Wild Mutations update, the newest, biggest update at the time of recording this, which has added like 35 possible mutations and a whole bunch of other new stuff that you can use to enhance or make more difficult or make more easy the runs, so that every run can have even more possible variety in it. These mutations have some pretty large sweeping effects, so you can do all sorts of things. And that, I think, does it really for Monster Train. It is an extremely solid deck builder in a genre that is getting pretty densely populated by now. It definitely stands head and shoulders above a lot of the others by being very unique and having some very different ideas as to what it wants to do. And like I said, it very much feels like a tabletop deck builder in terms of its overall rule set, which is really interesting because that's not all that usual for the video game versions, unless it's like a direct adaptation or something, but you know. So I would highly recommend it if you like deck builders. This is an extremely good one, and it has already been shown to have gotten some really neat updates. And if the other updates follow the same sort of mold that the Wild Mutations update did, then we're going to see some even cooler stuff as the time goes on. And it's overwhelmingly positively reviewed for a very good reason. It is a super solid deck builder, in a digital form. So there you go. The link, as always, will be in the description below this video. Please do go and check it out. It's absolutely worth it. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.